Wait a moment to make sure that the live stream has engaged. We've had some slow connection to the social media stream lately, so I'm just giving it a moment. Okay, here we go. That's good. And over here. Fabulous. Okay, here we go. A good vach. Shavua Tov, my holy brothers and sisters. If you're watching us on the East Coast, you're up late. Beautiful. Yasher koach to be studying Torah with us so late at night. It's a big merit. May you be zoiche. May you merit to reward, to merit an appropriate reward, to receive the reward for doing this kind of Torah study late at night. We firmly believe that our study adds peace to the world. And if you're laboring to study Torah by staying up late to do it, then you're adding that much more peace to the world. How are you all? We've emerged from Shabbos. We're entering a new week. Who is with us? Where are you tuning in from? Not seeing a lot of the usual comments, but Lindsay Adams says Shavua Tov from Ohio. Welcome, Lindsay. All right, beautiful. Hopefully a few more will join us, but we are the hardy, the ones who study Talmud after Shabbos in the summer. Shabbat ended here at 8:50. And while I learn my daf, I learn the page of Talmud I need to teach during the day on Shabbos, I can't take notes until after Shabbos, so I need a little bit of time to get myself ready. And, you know, when Shabbat ends that late, we end up having such a late class. Paula Schmidt-Klauser in the house from Chicago. BJ Stokey is with us from Santa Fe. Bryna Bloomfield says Shavua Tov. And thank you, Bryna. You sent me a private note. When I was talking about Shulchan Aruch the other day, you know, Kitzer Shulchan Aruch, Kitzer really just means small. But the writer, the author, is often referred to by the title of his master work, similar to the Chafetz Chaim. That's not his name, but we refer to him as the Chafetz Chaim because that's his most important book. So thank you for that note, Bryna. Okay. Let us get into it. We have tonight's daf is very physical, right? We're going to be talking about physical spaces very much. So where are we? We're in Tractate Shabbos, Masechet Shabbos, daf tzadi tes. We're page 99. We're in chapter 10. And today we're going to be discussing Tonight we're going to be discussing Mishnah number 2. Okay, so we're still talking about carrying on Shabbos and going from one domain to another. But now we're going to look at how the domains themselves, it might not be so clear what kind of a domain you're in. You know that when you're in your house, you're in a private domain. When you step out onto the street, you're in a public domain. That's pretty clear. We've seen that there's some unusual domains called a Carmelis, where, for example, a person's store is a private domain, the plaza outside is a public domain, but there could be a colonnade in between them, which is neither private nor public. Now we're going to talk about some domains that are private domains, but they're very small private domains, and we can be a little bit uncertain of, are they actually a private domain, or is it just another part of the public domain? So, in our Mishnah, we learn that if there is a rock, and the top of the rock is more than 10 tefachim, 10 handbreadths above ground level in the public domain, and the top of the rock is at least 4 tefachim by 4 tefachim, right? So the top of the rock is at least 4 handbreadths wide. Hold on a second. I just want to make sure I've got the correct measurements, and I'm pretty sure I am. Yeah. So the top of the rock is 4 handbreadths by 4 handbreadths. So an area, 4 handbreadths, it's going to be about anywhere from 16 to 20 inches. So let's say it's going to be 20 inches by 20 inches. So a square, a couple of, about 20 inches by 20 inches is a square. That's the top of the rock. And it's at least 10 handbreadths, 10 tefachim off the ground level. So it's separated from the public domain, and it forms its own private domain. So if you take an object from the public domain, let's say where you're holding it, you're in the public domain, you're holding this object, it's in the public domain, you put it on top of that rock, it's got that minimum measure of 4 handbreadths by 4 handbreadths at the top, and it's at least 10 handbreadths off the ground. So it's a private domain, and if you make this transfer, you have violated the Torah prohibition on carrying an object from the public domain into a private domain. The Mishnah is worded in an unusual way because it's talking about both a rock, which is above the public domain, and a pit, which is below the public domain. But the Mishnah doesn't say a rock or a pit, right? And the pit is going to have to be, as we're going to see, 10 handbreadths deep. But it doesn't say a rock 10 handbreadths high or a pit at least 10 handbreadths deep. What it says is a rock or the bank of a pit. Why? And as basically to sum up the dialogue about it, the discussion of it, because the pit doesn't have to be 10 handbreadths, 10 tefachim deep, meaning 10 tefachim below ground level of the public domain. How would that work? Imagine that people dig a hole and they only dig it 5 handbreadths deep. But in digging out the hole, they pile up the dirt that they dug out of the hole around the hole. And so now the pit itself, it's only 5 handbreadths below the ground level of the public domain, but its bank, the side of the pit, is actually 10 handbreadths high. In other words, the pit that's below the ground, the 5 handbreadths below, combines with that bank, that embankment that extends 5 handbreadths up above the ground level of the public domain, and now the inside of that pit is considered a private domain, separate from the public domain, even though it's not 10 handbreadths deep relative to the ground level of the public domain. Its wall, as it were, is 10 handbreadths high. And so if you transferred an object into it or took an object out of it, you would be making a prohibited transfer. And if you did this unwittingly on Shabbos, you would be liable to bring the sin offering. Recall, we're just taking it as a given, but if you're joining us and you haven't been with us along the way, we're only talking about carrying that is prohibited on Shabbos. During the week, of course, you could take something in or out of a pit. Who cares? You're welcome to do it. It happens in construction all the time. But it's a prohibited labor come Shabbos. Okay. Now we have the interesting case of a well. So a well, that's a pit, right? Often, and wells are sometimes in private domains. Somebody has a backyard well. But often a well is in a public domain. So if you have a well, it's a deep hole, there's water in it, it's in the public domain, you find it on Shabbos, you're really thirsty. You want to take a drink from the well. But if you reach into that well, with a bucket or a ladle or something, you take water from the well, which is at least 10 handbreadths deep and at least 4 handbreadths wide, let's say 4 by 4, so that is a private domain. That's a separate domain. And if you take water out of that well and then you drink it where you're standing in the public domain alongside the well, so now it's a problem. That would be a prohibited transfer, a prohibited carrying out, right? A carrying out of the water from the private domain to the public domain. But you're really thirsty. What do? So there's 2 solutions for this. If you just find that well, and you're really thirsty and it's Shabbos and you want to take a drink. First of all, if you're dying of thirst, you don't have to worry about this because we will violate Shabbos, we'll desecrate Shabbos to save a life. So if you're dying of thirst and you come upon a well in the desert, don't even worry about it. Take the drink. But if you're just very thirsty and this thing is a private domain, what can you do? Well, actually, if you get more than half of your body over the rim of the well, you don't want to fall in the well, you don't want to jump in the well, but if you can get more than half of your body into that private domain, even the airspace over that private domain, so now you can take a drink because you're not transferring water from the well to outside the well. You're drinking it while you're in the well, as it were. A more elegant solution, but one that you cannot do on Shabbos. You can prepare for Shabbos in this way, and this is what they would do in old times for these situations, is they would build a wall around the well. So if you had a wall that is 10 handbreadths high, 10 tefachim high, and it encircled the area of the well, and let's say, you leave a few feet on every side of the well for people to stand in, and however big an area you want to enclose, the wall encloses that area and makes a private domain, and now the well is in a private domain. So in the same way that if the well was in your backyard, you could certainly take a drink from it because you'd be transferring water from the private domain at the bottom of the well to the private domain in the yard, and that is permitted. And likewise here, if there was a wall surrounding the well, so then you would be covered. It would be okay. Okay, so Rav Mordechai brought a question to several of the sages. And who did he ask? Let's see, I didn't write down the names. But Rav Mordechai brought a dilemma to Rava, and then he's going to bring it to Rav Yosef, and then he's going to ask Abaye. So he's going to ask three different sages the same question. And he's going to say to them each, what if you throw an object onto a column that is more than 10 handbreadths tall and has a width at the top of the column that is 4 handbreadths, by at least 4 handbreadths by 4 handbreadths, or it might be circular with a diameter of 4 handbreadths. That's going to be enough. It just has to be 4 handbreadths wide. So the sages said to him, why are you asking? We have a Mishnah. We just learned in this Mishnah, if a rock is more than 10 handbreadths above... Wow. Sorry. Just noticed that the button on my jacket is broken. I don't know how that happened. Anyway, so the sages said to him, we have a Mishnah. If you transfer an object onto a rock and it's 10 handbreadths high and at least 4 handbreadths wide, that's the Mishnah. It's prohibited. You would be guilty of violating Shabbos if you made such a transfer. And so he said, he asked each of them and got that answer. And then after asking the third one, after asking Abaye, Rav Mordechai says, you are all spewing the same spittle. It's like they all gave him the same answer, which is good. The sages were consistent. I mean, very often the sages disagree with each other. Here's now getting a consistent answer. Rav Mordechai, what's the problem? So he explains, maybe the Mishnah was talking about a case where the object that's getting transferred onto that rock doesn't go above the rock. It sort of comes in at the level of the rock. And it's something that's so thin, like a piece of paper or a needle, that as it gets to the top, when it's even with the top surface, it slides right onto the top of the rock. Maybe that's the case of the Mishnah, says Rav Mordechai, because in the case of where I throw something onto a column that's more than 10 handbreadths high, that object is going to pass through the airspace, which is more than 10 handbreadths off the ground. And as we've seen, that's an exempt airspace. So it's actually entering this private domain through an exempt airspace. So maybe the person is exempt from bringing the sin offering because he didn't do something that was the subject of a Torah prohibition. Interestingly, the Gemara here does not answer Rav Mordechai. It goes on to some other cases, but luckily Rav Steinsaltz makes a note that said, well, it could have answered. We have that. The fact is, passing through that exempt airspace is not going to make the person exempt, because he took the object, he threw it up there onto that column. The fact that it landed by coming through the air, which is exempt, is not enough to exempt him. It's irrelevant. This person made a transfer from the public domain to a private domain, and he is liable to bring the sin offering if he did it unwittingly. Okay. He doesn't get an answer. Rav Steinsaltz tells us what the answer is, and we move on to a different set of cases. And these are kind of interesting because these are domains that change their status, right? A private domain, okay, so my backyard is my backyard. I might build things in my backyard, but it's still my backyard. I might sell my backyard, but it's still a private domain. What are these private domains that change from a domain to a non-domain? And so we get this example we saw already with the well, right? That there was the well itself is a private domain, and what moves right, butts up right against it is the public domain. But if we build a wall around the well, let's say a few feet away from the well, all the way around, so that there's place for people to stand, so then that whole area has been created. A private domain has been created just by virtue, of building that wall. So what if, for example, I throw an object onto the wall itself, right? And let's say that the wall is not 4 tefachim wide. It's not 4 handbreadths wide. So this object that I throw, it lands on a wall. It's 10 handbreadths high, but the wall itself is not 4 handbreadths wide. What is the status of this object now? Where is it, right? It's stopped on top of the wall. Is it still in the public domain, or is it in the private domain? The wall itself, the top of the wall, is not a private domain because it's not wide enough. Let's say it's only 2 handbreadths. It doesn't have that required area to be 4 handbreadths wide. So what have I done? And the answer that's given is, if this wall is sufficient to create a private domain within the enclosure, then it is sufficient to make its own self part of that private domain. So if I throw an object onto the wall and it lands on the wall itself, and I threw it from the public side, from the public domain side, so then I made a prohibited transfer. I would be liable. And the Gemara doesn't mention this, but I'm just thinking aloud that if I threw it from the inside up on top of the wall, I think I must be exempt, because we've just established that the wall is part of the private domain that it surrounds. Let's say we have a pit that is 9 tefachim deep, 9 handbreadths deep. And I take a shovel full of dirt from the pit and dump it outside the pit in the public domain. So the pit was 9 handbreadths deep. That's not deep enough to be its own private domain. But when I take that last shovelful out and put it out into the public domain, at the moment that I take that shovelful, I'm creating a pit that is 10 tefachim deep. And now when I move that shovelful out into the public domain and dump it there, have I made a prohibited carry, a prohibited transfer from the private domain to the public domain? The next shovelful, because now it is a pit, it is a private domain, and the next shovelful that I take out of it would definitely be a prohibited transfer. But the shovelful that turns it into a pit at the very moment that I take it is too close to the edge. The sages don't resolve this dilemma. We don't get an answer to this question. And because it's unresolved, we're going to have a lenient ruling as the halacha is established, over the centuries which follow these discussions. So it is the halacha is I'm exempt. I didn't take a shovel full of dirt from a private domain to a public domain when that shovel full of dirt itself created the private domain. Sort of the opposite case, let's say that the pit is 10 handbreadths deep, and I throw a rock into it. Now that the rock is in it and sort of covers the bottom of the pit, it's no longer 10 handbreadths deep. Now it's only 9 handbreadths deep. So the moment that rock lands there, it ceases to be a private domain. Now it's just another part of the public domain. This should be the opposite case. So if I'm going to be exempt, when I take that shovelful out, because at that moment I'm changing its status and I'm not going to be held liable for dumping that bit of dirt outside the hole. Now, when I add a rock in, right, and at the time that I throw the rock in, before the rock lands, it is a private domain. And so the action that I took, right, it was into what would have been a prohibited action. But when the rock lands, the pit ceases to be what it was. So according to the same logic that I was exempt before, I should be liable in this case. But I'm not, because this dilemma was not resolved. The sages were unsure. And in these two unresolved cases, we're going to get, because they were unresolved, the later ruling based on the discussion of the sages is lenient in both cases. So I'm going to be exempt in both cases, even though logically you would think that you couldn't be exempt in both since they have a different they create a different change of status. Okay. And the last case of these unresolved cases is that if, let's say there's 4 stakes. This is great. Like, this could only happen in a cartoon, right? So there's 4 stakes. They're more than 10 handbreadths high. They're like poles. Figure 4 poles that are at least 10 handbreadths high. And I take a board that is 4 handbreadths by 4 handbreadths, right? So like a wood board, and I throw it, and it lands on the 4 poles and like stays there. It's almost like this is like kids making a video. They throw it 300 times until it finally like stands on the 4 poles, and then they would pretend like, ooh, we did that on the first try. But if you could get that board to land on the 4 poles, I think they have a little illustration here. I mean, it would look like a table. Just think of it that way. It would look like a table, except the table legs are there, and I'm throwing the tabletop onto the legs, and it's going to land and stay. So when the board lands, that's a private domain. It's more than 10 handbreadths above the public domain, and it's 4 handbreadths by 4 handbreadths. But it didn't exist until the board landed on top of the poles. So am I liable for transferring something, for carrying from the public domain to the private domain when I throw that board up on the poles and create the private domain when that board lands on the table legs or on the poles, as it were? The sages leave this unresolved. They're not sure what the answer is. And so the halacha, the law, is that when you create the private domain in these circumstances, you're exempt from making that throw of the board. You're not liable to bring the sin offering. You didn't violate the Torah prohibition of carrying on Shabbos. That's what I've got for us today. I'm going to look at the comments to see if there's any questions I can answer for you. While you're thinking, if you want to write something to me, I'm thinking aloud, what is the takeaway from these cases, right? Where you have a domain that is created by the carrying, it's created by the transfer, and we subsequently, the sages weren't sure what to do with it, and the law became lenient and said when you create that domain with the final transfer, you're going to be exempt. You're not going to be liable to bring the sin offering. I think that these very tricky cases, on the one hand, they're more in the realm of hypothetical cases. These things are unlikely to happen, and we're just trying to understand, exactly how the law works. So we're studying Torah lishma, Torah for Torah's sake, so that we can understand God's will better for us and what are the limits of what's permitted and what is prohibited. But I think there are real world ramifications for this, because in addition to the idea that, well, the world changes and circumstances change, and so a law, which is an eternal law, it's going to have to be not reinterpreted or re-legislated, but continually understood in light of changing conditions. And sometimes there's just such a novel situation that you need the best rabbis of a generation to get together and rule. Is this thing permitted or prohibited? Is it obligated, etc.? So in addition to that kind of change, which is going on all the time, the physical world itself is changing, right? Sometimes, and this is a little bit of a Heisenberg effect, that in this situation, it is Heisenberg, right? Heisenberg principle. Now I'm just not sure. It's been so long since I was in college. But the idea that when you measure something, you change it, right? In the act of measuring a thing, you actually change it. And this is an important principle in quantum mechanics, but it also applies in life. And you can think about, in political questions, they take a poll, and the act of taking the poll sometimes changes a little bit the percentages of the people and what they feel about it. Likewise, when we take actions in the world, we sometimes change the world. Sometimes the world itself is changing, and I mean physically changing, like the geography is changing. Earthquakes happen, floods happen. Stuff is changing all the time. And so there are delicate areas where you really have to be careful. And if you want to be a pious person and make sure that you don't transgress, this is why you need a Rav in your life. You need a rabbi that you can bring questions to, and not everything can be looked up, because the situations, can be so malleable and ever-changing and difficult to apply the law. And sometimes the Rav is not going to be sure, but he's likely to know more than you do, right? And even a Rav has a Rav, right? So everyone knows that they need to have a really educated advisor to go to ask questions. And that's an important part of being an observant Jew, is having someone to go to with your questions for these and many other reasons. Okay. Not seeing questions, so I hope this is, let me see. Lynn over here on the YouTube side says, this one is confusing. This was the prior loading of the wagons with the two types of possible board shapes, the beams of the Mishkan we talked about yesterday. It is confusing. We're doing our best to understand it. Hopefully we've shed a little bit of light on it tonight. But have a Rav. You need a Rav. You need a Rav in your life. But also, we can't always get to the Rav to ask the question at the time that we need an answer, right? So there's just times when we're going to have to make our best guess. And in those cases, I think it's important to, first of all, separate, what the truth might be from what I want the truth to be, right? Because we're always going to have a bias toward the desired outcome. So we have to really be able to be objective with ourselves when there's a halachic question before us. And second, as the Talmud says, who is wise? One who sees the outcome of things, right? And so many problems arise in the world when there's a problem, so we pass a new law, or there's a problem, so we create a new solution. And then there are unintended consequences from the law or the implemented solution, whatever it was that was going to solve the problem before us, but then it's going to create a whole bunch of new problems. So every time we're embracing something new, every time we're creating a new solution to a problem or legislating a new law, any kind of fix like this in the world, we've got to be mindful of what consequences might there be. The older we get, the wiser we get, the better we're going to get at this, forward thinking, what will be the unexpected consequences. And may we be zoiche, may we merit to grow in wisdom so that we can see the outcomes of things before we get ourselves in trouble. All the best, my sisters and brothers.